Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick,
And I'm Gemma Files.
and this, of course, is No
No
Doubt
darkness but
But
ours.
Ours. Welcome to the third and final part of our podcast on queer horror. In our last episode, we discussed emerging new queer authors like Hayley Piper, Paula Ashe, and Eric LaRocca, queerness in the work of H.P. Lovecraft, and other queer authors of classic horror like Saki and Vernon Lee. In tonight's episode, we move on to queer authors of the recent past, such as David Rudkin, Michael McDowell, and Joel Lane, and also we discuss the power of sexuality as a force of both liberation and destruction. On the sort of, roots into queer horror, took a different one playwrights I've read because I went through a big phase of wanting to be, a playwright or a script writer instead of rather than a prose writer. And I read a lot of Howard Barker, and a lot of his stuff is very rooted in the idea of sexual desire as this kind of disruptive, liberating force that breaks through conventions and stuff. A lot of it seemed to be basically saying shacking is good. Oh, I'm on board with that.
Really? Yes, that's true. It
Can
can be.
That whole kind of straight male thing where sexual liberation means I get to fuck whoever I want kind of thing.
Shagging good, jealousy bad.
Yeah. But the other writer who went in a similar direction, and I think is a much more interesting writer in that sense, although far less prolific as a playwright, although he's done a lot of stuff for screen, is David Rudkin. And I think if you look at sort of Pender's Fen and sort of Stephen's sexuality in that, and the recognition that he has desires for other men, and that this isn't something to reject or be repressed. It's part of who he is, and it's part of his particular form of masculinity. And Rudkin's fascinating about this. He writes a lot. I mean, this is someone who came
from be queer, impure. Yeah, absolutely.
He came from his father was a revivalist minister, and his mother was a Northern Irish Protestant, which are both very conservative-seeming backgrounds. And recognizing his own bisexuality, I think, was one of the things that very much made him go in a very different direction than he might have. And you can see it. If you ever get the chance, there's a play of his called The Triumph of Death, which is, dear God, one of the most harrowing and bleak things I've ever encountered. But there's a lot there again about sexual repression and social repression, but also about this idea of something we were talking about before we recorded this podcast, that one of the things that separates us from the animals is consciousness, and it's something of a torment to us because we know we're going to die. We know that we're aware of things in a way that animals don't have to deal with. We agonize over stuff. Again, Rudkin was kind of like, there's all this kind of thing going on. That, in many ways, that led me back to reading horror. And of course, Clive Barker, as opposed to Howard, is one of the great queer. One of the great queer stories of his, which I think I absolutely love, and I think deserves a lot more recognition and attention than it usually gets. I think it's often, obviously, the stories from the books of blood that people tend to remember. There's the Forbidden. There's there's In the Hills, the Cities. There are so many magnificent stories, but the Madonna, where you have this creature which is almost like this kind of primal mother thing, continually birthing stuff, almost like Clark Ashton Smith's Above Sattler. But at the same time, these two men both kind of encounter it, and it starts to transform them into their bodies into female bodies. And for one of the men, it ultimately leads to sort of like horror and suicide. Because, oh my God, I'm being turned into, I'm not a man anymore. And for the other, it's like, actually, wow, this is fascinating. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just different. It's a transformation. And his, finally he embraces that, and it's like, I will go. Let's see where this takes me.
Absolutely. The one that always comes to my mind is The Age of Desire. Which on the one hand, obviously, it's like, well, is this good queer modeling? No, probably not. It's not a great idea to fuck a wall. It's not a great idea to fuck a policeman. It's not a great idea to fuck yourself to death, to fuck all your friends to death, but at the same time, who hasn't felt like that? Who at the mercy of sexuality hasn't felt like, man, if I just let all of this go, if I let it all out, then I could tear somebody apart and it would be amazing, and they'd probably like it too. It's like there is this feeling, it's like inside of the sex urge, I guess, of all types. There is the creative urge, but there's also the destructive urge, and the self-creative or recreative urge, and the self-destructive urge. It's like that moment of blackout, so orgasm blackout, where it's like you get sucked down into this black hole and you're like, yeah, I might come back, I might not, it doesn't matter. It just does not matter. And again, I think this is the thing that we can all sort of agree upon. We can agree that we all like to cuddle. We can agree that we all want to, get into bed with somebody and hug them. And I think we can agree that we all, at one time or another have been at the absolute mercy of our urges and our areas.
Oh God, when I think about how I was when I was in my 20s, and I really wish I just shagged a hell of a lot more. I had this I struggled to disentangle sexual desire and emotional attachment, which kind of meant it was just, which made it kind of really difficult, made it impossible really to just have a casual hookup, because it was kind of like any woman I was attracted to. I was immediately sort of thinking about, could this be a relationship? Could this be a potential partner? And it's kind of like, well, maybe no, but maybe you'd get a hell of a good night's fun out of this. And I kind of wish I'd been able to sort of just get laid a lot, and then
Well, I remember seeing Cruising and being like, oh my God, that looks so great. Seriously, it's like that's the dream of, extreme.
I wouldn't sort of, again, I mean, there's in terms of regret. I mean, yes, I haven't had that quite in terms of my sex life. I haven't quite had as much of a wild, fun time as I would want. But at the same time, I'm kind of at peace with the fact that, okay, that's something I haven't done. I wouldn't trade what I have now, which is a very supportive and loving monogamous relationship, for what would basically be a few orgasms.
Yeah.
When you've seen, you watch enough porn and it's all kind of like, yeah, you just stick, something gets stuck somewhere.
It's like literally, yeah. It's like that's the word that you hear the most often. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh God.
Oh God. Oh yeah. It's like those are the two ends of human sexuality.
I still remember when I lived in Swinton, my bedroom that was like directly, because I was in a terraced house, like a row of houses. Is it what they call a row house in the States?
Yeah.
The house next door, their bedroom was basically on the other side of this wall. And my first night in the new house, I was writing a ghost story.
Yeah. I
was like writing a novella. I was about halfway through it, so I was on like the third sort of night in total of writing it. But the first night in my new home, no music on, and there's a creak. I am therefore bricking it for the rest of the night. I'm terrified when I get up to go to the bathroom, convinced I'm going to see this like figure in white at the bottom of the stairs. The second night I put some music on, and then there's a noise. I'm like, what the fuck? Switch it off. Coming through the wall. Fucking hacker from the New Zealand rugby team. At this point, I was like, after the initial kind of what was that noise? I was like so tempted to bang on the door, bang on the wall, and going, "Go on, my son, give her one from me." But apparently they were. I had a friend staying in my spare room at one point. I came back late one night, and he kind of came downstairs, white faced, and said, "Your neighbours are lunatics." I'm like, what? He basically heard the same sound effects coming through, but then he heard the guy say, yes, hurt me, you fucker. It was slightly, what the hell's going on? And I think the couple who moved in afterwards said they were getting these incredibly hardcore porn mags coming through the door addressed to the people. I think there was at least one time they'd had some kind of swingers thing going on the next door, and I didn't get a fucking invite, the bastards.
Wow.
But there was another couple sort of that came along later, and they were very, oh God, oh God, oh God. She was the religious. It was, I never did bang on the wall and say, "Go on, my son, give her one for me."
Good.
But yeah, this is good. Somebody was getting to have a good time anyway, and they. Well, I was.
And that's the whole point. That is the whole point. Yeah, and in terms of horror, it's like the thing inside of love the worm in every heart, right? It's like the thing in the the invisible worm that flies through the wind and the howling storm, and it's like, but all we want is love, all we want is pleasure, all we want is that moment of solace and that moment of connection, and there's like so much pain that comes out of that sometimes. It's like, more than anything else, it's like, I guess I could have stand to have done more freeing orgasmic things with my youth, but at the same time, I'm glad that I didn't. I'm glad that I don't think that I hurt anybody as much as I got hurt. At least I don't think that I did. And yet, knowing the way that you can get hurt, I think, is useful. And this is the baseline of sexuality in general. It's like heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality. It's always that. It's like you open it up, and maybe there's a pearl, and maybe there's a pearl, and maybe there's a piece of grit, and maybe there's a piece of grit stuck inside a pearl, and you still have to masturbate with it. It's like it's just it's impossible to disentangle, and that's where horror goes, and that's why queer horror is like every other type of horror. Horror, yes, is essentially, I guess, liminal, and essentially it occurs where things cross over, and it occurs where you go, well, that's different, but at the same time, it's still the human condition. The human condition is you either jump across the thing to the thing that looks different, or you don't, and you get stuck there, and something happens because of that. And one way or another, you die.
You just kind of have to have this trying to enjoy yourself as much without harming any people along the way. Incidentally, another writer we haven't mentioned. Somebody I came across sort of researching this and haven't had a chance to read him yet. There's a writer called J.B. Laws. Now he wrote during he died very young. He was a casualty of the AIDS epidemic of the 80s.
Right. I may be wrong, but I think Michael McDowell was as well.
I think he might have been. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not too familiar with McDowell's stuff, but I know the people who talked about the Blackwater series of books.
Yeah. He's an interesting example of a queer author who did not write about queerness very much, but when he did, it was really there's a short story that he wrote which was published in one of the Valancourt book of horror short stories, and called Miss Mac, which is really fascinating because essentially it's about a guy who it's about a guy who realizes that the woman that he wants to marry is sort of being taken away from him by this gym she's a teacher. They're all teachers in this little school, and by this gym teacher who's fairly obviously gay and like a lesbian lady, and and she's just sort of and his fiance to be the person that he's moving everything towards, is sort of like, oh no, I can't go out with you this week. I have to go fishing with Miss Mac, or whatever. It's just like more and more, they're spending more and more time together, and he's just like, this is not right. So as far as I can tell, he goes home to his mom, who may be a witch, and figures out a way to get rid of Miss Mac, which is quite horrifying. But yeah, everything is like very sub rosa, but you look at it and you're like, that is what you're saying, right? Yeah, no, that is definitely what you're saying there. Okay, I understand.
I think what I can tell, Laws was writing. I mean, I'm reading up the kind of the intro to Steam, his first novel. San Francisco was once a city of music and laughter, of parties and bathhouses when days held promise and nights romance. But now something sinister haunts the streets and alleyways, something that crept in with the fog to seek a cruel revenge. Flint, owner of a once thriving bathhouse, now ravaged by a disease that has no cure, gives himself over to the evil lurking in the steam. Dying men get tickets that say admit one, hoping for release, only to be dragged into the maelstrom. David, a writer of gay porn, finds himself writing another kind of story. His friend Eddie disappears from his hospital bed, leaving slime and mold, then returns for David. Meanwhile, Bobby is searching for his lover, lost in the same horror.
That sounds amazing.
I know.
I absolutely want to write it. I absolutely want to read that.
Well, you can get it
I
on
could
Kindle. It was first published in 1991. So he because Laws himself died at the age of 34.
Yes.
In around the time it was published, I think he only had time to write the two. Yeah, he died in 1992. So Steam was published just before that. His second novel, The Unfinished, was published posthumously, and I believe that's again, it's something that he was a gay man living with AIDS and writing head on about about those horrors. So I'm very much looking for. This is a book I've been very much wanting to read.
Speaking of gay history making its way into gay horror, I cannot let this go by without talking about Red X by David Demchuk.
Heard of Demchuk? Yeah, I've been meaning to. Red X, is that?
Red X, yeah. So David Demchuk is a playwright and has been working at the CBC for a long time, and has written so far 2 horror novels, one of which was published by Cheesine, and the other of which was not. And the first one's The Bone Mother, where he takes essentially stories from his Ukrainian background and writes these tiny little stories around them, almost pictures, pieces of flash that
like vignettes.
Like vignettes that he's organized around these old photographs that he found. But as you go through the book, they hook up and the characters start to appear again and again and again. And by the end, you're like, oh, no, this is all one story. That's interesting. So, from that, he went to Red X, and Red X manages to be a genuine decade by decade history of gayness in Toronto. Not only the gay, what used to be called the gay ghetto in Toronto, but also of, the sort of evolution of gayness as an identity, also bringing in lesbianism and people who are bi and people who are trans, but queerness as an identity. So the evolution of queerness as an identity, several different mysteries that happened in and around the Cabbagetown area of Toronto, including the Cabbagetown tunnel monster,
Okay.
And a fairly recent serial killer who operated in and around
So these
around
actual real cases you're
an
talking about.
actual, yeah. I mean, the Cabbagetown tunnel monster is it's a cryptid. It's a story. But the serial killer case that he's talking about is genuine, is real, except here he combines the two so that it's like, well, there's an actual monster, a
Right.
thing that's sort of like a member of the Fae, sort of like a ghost, sort of like a monster of a different type, a shapeshifter, that preys on people inside of this area of Toronto. And, from every generation, somebody gets snatched, maybe a couple of people. And so the disappearance of these people becomes folded into the normal quote um, difficulties of being queer in Toronto. It's like, was this person snatched by a monster, or were they killed by the cops? Was this person taken on the Cherry Beach Express? Did they die of AIDS? Did they become homeless? Did they, it's like, what happened? It's like, is there a monster, or is it just all the difficulties of having a non-default identity in a default world? And I just, it's beautiful. It is. He does that thing that I love so much, where he takes, it's like, and in a couple of places he becomes the narrator. David becomes the narrator of this story, and so he folds in his own gayness and his own love of horror and his own, it's like, how can I want to play around in this darkness when life is hard enough? Just being who I am, and there's a beautiful poetry about it. There's an incredible language about it. It's just, it's like, I can't say enough. The other person that I would mention is Michael Rowe. Michael Rowe and I both came up through cheesing. And he folds, he certainly folds his sexuality into everything that he's done. But he also is a writer of great delicacy and great strength, and a writer of straight up gothic horror. Probably the thing that I would recommend from him is Wildfell. Wildfell is yes, Enter Night was his first book. Wildfell was his second book. And it's it is a fascinating sort of a haunted house story, which is sort of a haunted island story, which is sort of a haunted life story.
Okay, I want to read this.
Yes.
Oh, and another queer man. I can't. I've referred to him in a context of his commentaries on other writers, but Joel Lane.
Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, a dear friend.
Yeah.
A wonderful person, an amazing writer. One of the finest, possibly one of the few real geniuses we've had.
That's my husband. giving me coffee. Sorry about that. Okay, so Joel Lane.
Certainly his short fiction and his novellas. Certainly, I mean, he wrote the novels he published while explicitly queer themed aren't really horror, although still well worth reading. But his he always talked about writing a horror novel, and I would have loved to have seen what he would have done with it. But his short fiction, I mean, probably the nearest thing he came to writing a horror novel was the collection that won the World Fantasy Award very shortly before he died, which is Where Furnaces Burn, which he'd written a cycle of short stories around a sort of what he called his weird police stories. They're almost like they're told from the viewpoint of an unnamed police officer, which is itself probably a bit of a homage to Derek Raymond with the nameless detective sergeant.
Yes.
the factory novels, often encountering various kinds of weird shit in the West Midlands. There would always
Yeah.
be, some deep, as with a lot of Joel's stuff, there'd always be some deeply complex, sort of underlying stuff on it. Anyway, anyone who's not read Joel really needs to read his short fiction, The Earthwire, The Lost District, the Terrible Changes, I'm sure there's another collection I've missed, and Where Furnaces Burn, and the novellas like the novella The Witnesses Have Gone. Just even when not explicitly, sometimes explicitly queer themed, but all of his stuff is astonishingly worth reading and filled with social commentary and poet's eye for detail, and very sarcastic wit, including puns that should have been outlawed by the Geneva Convention.
Tom Reamy is a really interesting case.
Under the Hollywood Sign, was that one of his?
Under the Hollywood Sign, yes, absolutely. I am not sure what Tom Reamy identified himself as, but he died again very young. I believe he died of a heart attack. And Under the Hollywood Sign is one of the most depressing, realistic, noirish, awful stories about internalized homophobia that I've ever read, and it's just amazing. The main character is essentially a corrupt cop in, I believe, San Francisco, and he's trying real hard to just completely conceal himself from the people around him, but he's also preying on people, because things have to get out. They have to get out. And, when you pinch your hose in one place, it's going to pop open in another place, and he ends up finding this young man, this beautiful young man, who he realizes is an angel. But he being who he is, he, like a fallen angel, he being who he is, he, arrests this guy and takes him home and chains him naked to a radiator and just keeps having sex with him. Very, very good fun.
George.
Yeah. And what you move towards is this realization, as the angel admits at one point that this is his hell, that this is what happens when you rise against God. You get condemned to the world of the flesh. You can get condemned to San Francisco and a corrupt, internalized homophobic, gay cop, chains you to a radiator and rapes you over and over. It's like,
I suppose in a way we're kind of, a lot of the time in sexuality we're looking for some form of transcendence, some form of even if it's only the little death of the orgasm, kind of temporarily.
Yeah, exactly. And this guy definitely is absolutely attracted to this creature because he sees the transcendence in him. He sees, you are not human. Your beauty is not human. Somehow this is going to transfer to me and it'll make me better. It'll wash me clean to some degree. And it's like, no, it's not going to wash you clean. The only thing you're going to do is to sully me and damn yourself. Yeah. And it's a fascinating story. That is the kind of story that I'm sure that people of a certain generation, queer zillennials who've always been able to say who they are, might look at and go, oh my God, what is wrong with this? And I'm like, you have to take it in context, but better yet, you have to take it within the context, not just of when it was written or who it was written by, but the context that the underside of everything remains, there's the beauty and then there's the awfulness. and they're not really, they cross over. You cannot really disentangle them from each other.
I was thinking as well in terms of, you know, stuff that might modern readers might struggle to get their heads around. There's a lot of Machen in that sense, and a lot of his stuff, you know, sexuality is very much linked with, you know, sort of moral, spiritual degradation. I mean, but of course, writing at the time he was writing, he is so fucking coy about what is actually going on. That
I remember reading Machen when I was a kid, like, you know, even when I was like in my early teens, you know, so like 13, 14, and going like, but what happened? What was it that happened?
What was so terrible?
Yeah, what was so awful? You know, it's like, what did you see?
And how much of this is, and again, how much of what, you know,
the marriage in the shade, you know, it's like,
and how much of what he's talking about is even really be wrong to us. I mean, people have said, for example, that the novel of the White Powder is something of a metaphor for venereal disease, from syphilis, presumably, as that's
possibly, yeah.
That was still a horrendous. You know, you could still look forward to dying in. That was, I suppose, that was kind of like the AIDS of its time, in the sense it was almost it was very difficult to cure, especially once it had.
Yeah, absolutely. And you pass it on to your children.
And once it finally emerges, there is no, you know, it's as a metaphor for, you know, sort of, for, you know, sexual transgression as a sin that kind of like destroys you. It's you know, it's a very good, it's, you know, it's ripe with, it's just a way of waiting for fundamentalist arseholes to seize upon, you know. It's sort of
getting all spongy.
Yeah, exactly. And horrifying. So it's not of the White Powder, but I mean, as I said, Rosanne Rabinowitz's novella Helen's Story is truly excellent, because it basically updates that idea of Helen Vaughan is alive and well and living in a, you know, bisexual artists collective in Lambeth,
which makes sense.
Something like that. But I mean, there is some discussion of, you know, the character of Rachel, who's her childhood companion, but the idea that I think it's kind of hinted at in The Great God Pan that some sort of sexual encounter took place between Helen and Rachel is kind of like, I've been violent, you know. It's kind of like
Helen, Rachel, and possibly The Great God Pan.
Well, yes, I think she actually talks about her and her companion kind of passing Rachel back and forth behind them, but it sounds like they were all having a whale of a time. But you know, so there is the again, the stuff in that Machen would perceive as the horrendous violation of the natural order of things, which is not. I mean, again, you compare it to Barker and his sexual openness and his sort of recognition that it's not this just because this is different and outside the norm doesn't and looks like what the fuck doesn't mean it's bad. And it's kind of like if you're discovering Machen after you've encountered people like Barker, then you kind of have, it takes a little bit. You actually kind of have to work backwards and kind of getting your head around what is actually all this terrible evil we're talking about, Arthur.
Yeah, and, when you think about it, the Last Will and Testament of Jacqueline S is kind of like his version of The Great God Pan, in that
yes, it is, isn't it?
Yeah, she becomes like this Helen Vaughan like protoplasmic character who can just reshape herself at will. And, you know, it's like if you enter into it with her, then great. And if you don't, then it's possible you might get pierced all over. You know, it's like your dick might break off and crawl up inside of her or something like that. But, you know,
that's fun shit like that.
That's your problem, really. It's like, man.
I feel like this is probably a whole bunch of. There's a whole bunch of writers that we've hardly talked.
We absolutely have been skipping a bunch of people. So why don't we stop with this right now and then get back together and do it a little bit more. So conceptually, we started off with the idea of queer horror, and we ended up, talking about identity. We ended up talking about representation. We ended up talking about sexuality in general. And horror and body horror, and we didn't even dip real down into, trans horror, the difference between, gay horror and lesbian horror, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We talked a lot about classic gay horror writers, gay male horror writers, but there's like actually a lot of this is sort of like when I was giving a lecture on queer horror, and I said, and then later we'll talk about Carmilla, and then I never did. This lady came up to me afterwards and said, I was really waiting to hear you talk about Carmilla, and I was like, fuck.
How the fuck did we not mention Carmilla? Jesus Christ!
I mentioned her, and then I was like, "We'll get to her later." And then I talked.
We'll get to her later.
Then I talked about dudes for 2 hours, and that's why my early stuff is a big bag of dicks.
Yes, if somebody says it's a bag of dicks in one of your stories, somebody quite possibly will.
Exactly.
One way or another, be it fellatio or ingestion.
It's true.
Okay, so that is it for now. But that is by far the end of our odyssey through queer horror. So we hope you enjoyed this. Please let us know what you thought, and more importantly, who have we missed out? Who would you like to hear us talking about?
Yes.
Who should we be talking about? Who we're hoping to do some interviews as well with some of the authors that we've discussed. So again, who haven't we mentioned? Who would you like to hear us in conversation with? Please let us know in the comments below. And until then, I have been Simon Bestwick.
And I have been Gemma Files. And this, of course, has been No Darkness.
No Darkness.
But ours.
I think I actually briefly forgot my own name there for a moment.
Yes.
I obviously need to drink more Pepsi Max.
That must be it.
Yes.